The alien warship loomed over the small human transport, its shadow stretching across the empty void of space. Inside the command deck, Commander Excelsior watched with mild amusement as his soldiers surrounded the tiny vessel. It had no weapons, no defenses, just a single life signature aboard. A weak one. Pathetic, Selkor muttered. Board the ship, take the human alive. The soldiers moved swiftly, cutting through the ship's weak hull and storming inside. They expected resistance, maybe a hidden weapon, a last attempt at survival. But there was nothing. Only one old human sat inside, waiting for them. His hair was silver, his skin wrinkled with age, and he wore an old, worn-out jacket with faded insignias on the sleeves. His hands rested on his knees, calm, as if he had been expecting them. "Ah," the old man said with a small smile. "Took you long enough." The soldiers hesitated for a moment. There was something strange about the way he looked at them, like he wasn't afraid at all. But then, with a barked order from their leader, they grabbed him, shackling his hands and dragging him toward the airlock. As they led him onto the alien warship, the old man glanced back at his tiny transport, the corners of his lips twitching. "You're making a mistake," he said. Selkor scoffed. "The only mistake here is yours, human. You are alone. You have no weapons. You are at the mercy of the great Zarkari Empire." The old man chuckled. "At your mercy." He shook his head. "No, Commander. You just set something in motion you won't be able to stop." Selkor ignored him. He didn't have time for the ramblings of a weak old man. Inside the warship, the human was taken to the interrogation chamber. The guards pushed him into a chair, locking his restraints to the metal frame. The room was cold and dark, the air filled with a low hum from the ship's systems. A Zarkari officer stepped forward, placing a scanning device near the human's head. "State your name." The old man tilted his head slightly, his eyes twinkling. "Daniel." The officer frowned. "Daniel what?" "Just Daniel," he said simply. Selkor watched from the observation window, growing impatient. "Run a full scan on him. I want every detail. If he is a soldier or spy, we will extract the information one way or another." The machine whirred to life, scanning Daniel's body, analyzing his biology, searching for cybernetic implants or hidden weapons. But the results were strange. "Sir," the officer hesitated. He's just a human. Old. Weak. No weapons. No enhancements." Selkor narrowed his eyes. "Then why is he so calm?" Before the officer could answer, the ship's lights flickered. The hum of the engines stuttered for a moment, as if something had briefly disrupted the power. Daniel exhaled, a slow, patient breath. "You feel that?" he asked, his voice carrying an eerie calmness. The officer ignored him, tapping at the controls. "There's some kind of interference. I don't know where it's coming from." Selkor clenched his fists. He had no time for malfunctions. "Forget it. Focus on the interrogation." The officer turned back to Daniel. "Why were you traveling alone?" Daniel smiled. "Who said I was alone?" A chill ran through the officer's spine. Something about the way he said that felt wrong. He glanced at the monitors again, checking the scanners. No other life forms detected. No distress signals sent. He was lying. He had to be. But before the officer could push further, the ship's alarms blared to life. Red warning lights flashed across the room. "Unidentified signal detected," a voice shouted over the comms. Selkor's eyes snapped toward the main control panel. "What signal? Where is it coming from?" The crew scrambled, their claws tapping frantically at their consoles. "We don't know. It's coming from deep space, but it's affecting our systems." Daniel leaned back in his chair, completely at ease despite the chaos. "Ah," he murmured. "Right on time." Selkor turned to glare at him. "What did you do?" Daniel gave him a small, almost pitying smile. "You captured me, Commander," he said. "Now they're coming to get me back." Selkor felt a creeping dread settle into his chest. For the first time since the capture, he realized something was very wrong. The warship trembled, lights flickered again, and an eerie silence followed, broken only by the distant hum of the engines struggling to maintain stability. Selkor stormed out of the observation room, his claws clicking sharply against the metallic floor. His patience was wearing thin. "Report," he barked as he entered the control deck. A nervous officer turned, his scales paling. "Commander, something is jamming our sensors. We cannot locate the source, but it's affecting our navigation systems." Selkor clenched his fists. This was supposed to be a simple capture, just an old human, alone in space. And yet, ever since they brought him aboard, things had started to go wrong. His sharp gaze flicked to the surveillance feed showing the interrogation room. The old human, Daniel, sat calmly in his chair, hands still shackled, watching the security camera as if he knew Selkor was looking at him. Selkor snarled. "Enough of this nonsense." He activated the comm link. "Continue the interrogation. I want answers. Now." In the interrogation room, the officer in charge hesitated before stepping closer to Daniel. "Tell us," the officer growled, "who is coming for you?" Daniel tilted his head, amused. "Oh, you don't know. I thought the mighty Zarkari Empire had intelligence on everyone." The officer slammed a clawed fist on the table. "Enough games. Who are you really?" Daniel sighed. "You wouldn't believe me if I told you." The officer gritted his teeth and turned toward the guards. "Increase the pressure. Raise the energy field." The restraints hummed, glowing with power. A normal human would have screamed in pain. But Daniel simply closed his eyes, exhaling slowly. Then, the ship shuddered violently. "Commander," a panicked voice called over the intercom. "Something just entered our proximity zone. We don't know what it is." Selkor whipped around. "Show me." A holographic display flickered to life. At first, there was nothing but the vast emptiness of space. Then, a distortion appeared, a ripple, like light bending unnaturally. And then they saw it. A massive vessel, far larger than their warship, emerged from the void, its dark, angular hull unlike anything the Zarkari had encountered before. It wasn't registered in any galactic database. It had no known insignia. And worst of all, it had just appeared out of nowhere. Selkor's stomach twisted. What is that?" The ship's comms crackled. A voice, deep and full of authority, resonated through the speakers. "You have one of ours." The entire command deck fell silent. The alien crew exchanged uncertain glances. The message was clear. Whoever these beings were, they had come for Daniel. In the interrogation room, Daniel chuckled softly. "Told you." The officer in charge felt a cold sweat drip down his spine. "Release me now," Daniel said, his voice calm but firm, "or you'll find out why capturing me was the biggest mistake of your lives." Selkor's claws dug into his armrests as he glared at the screen. He had underestimated the human. And now he was about to find out just how dangerous Daniel really was. The warship's alarms blared, bathing the control deck in flashing red light. The massive, unknown vessel loomed outside, motionless but menacing. It had appeared out of nowhere, without any hyperspace signature, without warning, as if it had always been there, waiting. Selkor gritted his teeth. "Hail them," he barked at his communications officer. The officer's claws trembled as he worked the controls. "They're ignoring our signals, Commander." "Raise shields. Prepare weapons," Selkor ordered. But before his crew could respond, the enemy ship moved. It didn't fire. It didn't send more messages. It simply shifted slightly, and in that moment, every sensor on the Zarkari warship malfunctioned. Screens went black, targeting systems glitched, and power levels dropped dangerously low. Selkor's heart pounded. This was not normal. Back in the interrogation room, Daniel chuckled again. He tilted his head, watching the ceiling as if he could sense everything happening. "You feel it, don't you?" he said, his voice casual. "That pressure in the air. That cold chill running down your spine. You ever wonder what it feels like to have a gun pointed at your head? One you can't see, can't hear, but know is there. The Zarkari officer in charge of his interrogation shifted uncomfortably. What? What is that ship? Daniel finally looked at him, eyes gleaming. Oh, that's family. And they don't take kindly to people messing with me. The ship's comms crackled again. The same deep, commanding voice returned. Release him. Now. Selkor snarled. He was a commander of the Zarkari Empire, a warrior who had conquered dozens of worlds. He would not bow to an old human and his mysterious allies. Ignore them, he snapped. Arm all torpedoes. Target their engines. His weapons officer hesitated. Commander, do it. The officer swallowed hard and pressed the controls. Torpedo bays hummed to life, the ship's targeting systems struggling against the interference from the enemy vessel. But before they could fire, everything changed. The alien warship vanished. Not into hyperspace, not through a cloaking system. It simply disappeared, like it had never been there at all. The Zarkari crew blinked in shock. Where did it go? One officer whispered. Selker's claws dug into his seat. Find it. Now. Before they could scan, the lights flickered again. Then, without warning, an invisible force slammed into the ship. The warship lurched, sending crew members flying. Sparks exploded from consoles. Something massive had just collided with them. Something they couldn't see. Then, for the first time in his life, Selkor felt fear. Because as the lights flickered back on, his screens filled with new readings. Hundreds of smaller objects were now surrounding them, appearing out of the void. No life signs, no energy signals, but they were there, watching, waiting. Daniel sighed, shaking his head. You really should have let me go when you had the chance, he muttered. The Zarkari warship groaned as unseen forces pressed against its hull. The alarms blared continuously, but no one on the command deck moved to silence them. They were frozen in fear. Selkor clenched his fists, his claws digging into his palm. What? What is happening? His officers scrambled for answers, but the sensors were useless. One moment, the readings showed nothing but empty space. The next, hundreds of unknown objects surrounded them. The enemy ship was gone, but its presence still weighed on them. It had left something behind. Selkor turned to his science officer. Can you identify those objects? The officer's tail twitched nervously. Commander, they aren't emitting any energy signatures. It's like they don't exist, but the ship's hull sensors say they're there. Then what are they? Selkor snarled. The officer gulped. I don't know, but they're moving. Selkor snapped his head toward the main screen. The darkness outside shifted. The objects, whatever they were closing in. A sudden metallic groan echoed through the warship, as if something immense was pressing against the hull. Then, the lights went out. Complete and total darkness swallowed the command deck. The hum of the ship's core faltered. For the first time in his life, Selkor felt helpless. And then, a single voice spoke. Not through the ship's speakers, not through any communication system. It spoke inside their heads. You have made a mistake. Selkor gasped, his breathing sharp and uneven. He turned, eyes wide, trying to find the source. His crew clutched their heads, their expressions twisted in confusion and terror. The voice was not Zarkari. It was not human. It was something else. Release him now, and you may leave with your lives. Selkor growled through his fear. Neveer, he roared. The moment he spoke, the warship lurched violently. Consoles exploded, sending sparks raining down. The floor buckled as the entire vessel tilted unnaturally. Something was outside, pulling them, dragging them. The emergency lights flickered back on, dim red glows illuminating the terrified faces of his crew. The sensors came back online just long enough to register something impossible. They were no longer in the same star system. Selker's breath caught in his throat. That wasn't possible. They hadn't engaged their FTL drives. They hadn't moved. Something had moved them. A voice crackled through the comms, breaking the silence. "Commander." It was a crewman from the lower decks. His voice was trembling. Zelker slammed his claw on the console. "Report." The crewman stammered. "Yes, sir. The interrogation room. The human. He's gone." Selker's eyes widened. "What?" The officer's breathing was shaky. The guards, they were just standing there, staring into space. I tried shaking them, but they wouldn't respond. When I looked inside the room, it was empty. Selker snapped his head toward the security feeds. He cycled through the cameras, searching for Daniel. But the screens showed nothing. The interrogation room was completely untouched. No sign of a struggle. No sign of an escape. The restraints were still locked, as if he had never been there. Selker's claws tightened around the console. Where is he? No one had an answer. Then, the warship shuddered again. This time, it wasn't turbulence. It wasn't an attack. It was something inside. The comm channels erupted with panicked voices. "Yes, sir. Something's here. The lower decks, doors are opening on their own. Weapons bay. Shut down. We can't arm anything." Selker's breathing became ragged. This wasn't just a simple rescue. Something had invaded his ship. And in the interrogation room, though empty, the security cameras finally glitched back to life. For a brief moment, the feed flickered. And for less than a second, a shadowy figure appeared on the screen. A human silhouette. Standing right where Daniel had been. Watching. Waiting. And then it vanished. Selker's claws dug into the console as he watched the security footage. His mind raced. The human, Daniel, had disappeared from the interrogation room. No traces, no escape routes, nothing. And now something was loose on his ship. The warship trembled again. This time, it was worse. The metal groaned, the floor vibrated, and distant screams echoed through the comms. Selker slammed his fist onto the control panel. "Report." A panicked officer shouted. "Sir, sections B4 and C2 have gone completely silent. No life signs detected." Selker's blood ran cold. "What do you mean, no life signs?" The officer swallowed hard. The crew in those areas, they just vanished. Their comm signals were active one moment, and the next, gone. No bodies, no traces. Selker bared his fangs. "That's impossible. A whole squad doesn't just disappear." The lights flickered again. Then the warship's gravity shifted. Selker's feet lifted off the ground. The crew screamed as the entire bridge tilted sideways, sending them crashing into walls and consoles. Sparks rained from broken panels. A few officers were flung into the air, floating helplessly. And then, darkness. For the first time, in all of Selker's years commanding this warship, the power completely shut down. Everything was silent. The only thing they could hear was their own breathing. Then, through the eerie darkness, a voice whispered, "You took the wrong prisoner." Selker's eyes widened. He recognized that voice. It was Daniel. But something was wrong. His voice didn't sound like it came from one direction. It came from everywhere. "Turn on emergency backup power." Selker shouted, his voice laced with panic. A few officers scrambled to obey, their claws shaking as they worked. But the controls didn't respond. Then, a deep metallic groan echoed through the ship. The floor shifted again. The crew could barely see in the darkness, but something moved in the shadows. A cold presence filled the air. It was like the ship itself was breathing. Selker's heart pounded. "Secure all exits. We need to find him." A desperate cry came through the comms. "Commander, help. We see him." Static. Then silence. The crew looked at Selker in terror. Another officer stammered. "That transmission came from the weapons bay." Selker's claws tightened. He knew what he had to do. "Arm yourselves," he growled. "We're going after him." They had captured an old human. But now, something else was hunting them. Selker and his remaining officers moved cautiously through the dimly lit corridors of the warship. The emergency backup power had finally flickered to life, but the ship was still running on minimal energy. Shadows stretched across the walls, flickering with every emergency light that pulsed weakly. The warship was silent. Too silent. Every Zarkari officer was armed, their weapons glowing with faint energy. Yet none of them felt safe. They were being hunted. Selker gritted his teeth as he led the team toward the weapons bay, where the last transmission had come from. He had captured many enemies in his lifetime, but never had he seen anything like this. The human was old, weak, unarmed. Yet, somehow he had turned the entire ship against them. A security officer's voice broke the tense silence. "Commander, the ship's internal sensors, they're malfunctioning. I can't track anything properly." Selker growled. "Keep moving. We'll find him ourselves." They passed a row of empty storage lockers. The doors were slightly ajar, creaking faintly as they swayed. The air felt thick, like something unseen was pressing down on them. Then, a noise, a faint tapping sound. Selker stopped, raising his hand. His team froze. The tapping came again. Soft, rhythmic, deliberate. One of the officers turned toward a corridor to the right. His breathing hitched. "Sir," he whispered, his voice barely audible. Selker turned his head, and his blood ran cold. At the far end of the corridor stood a figure. Tall, shadowed, unmoving. For a moment, Selker couldn't breathe. The figure's posture, the outline of its frame. It was Daniel. But something was wrong. The old human stood perfectly still, his hands at his sides. His face was hidden in the dim light. Then he tilted his head, not like a normal movement. Too sharp, too unnatural. A single step echoed through the hall as Daniel moved forward. Selker raised his weapon. "Don't move." Daniel didn't stop. Selker snarled. "I say don't move." The old man smiled, a slow, knowing smile. And then the lights exploded. Total darkness. A Zarkari officer screamed. Selker turned, claws tightening on his weapon. Fire. The corridor erupted with bright blue laser fire. Beams ripped through the darkness, lighting up the hall in flashes. The energy blasts hit nothing. Daniel was gone. Another officer let out a choked gasp. "See, Commander, we've lost." A horrible crunching sound cut him off. Selker spun around. The officer was gone. Only his rifle clattered to the floor, spinning slowly before coming to a stop. The team backed up instinctively, their weapons shaking. Selker snarled, "Stay together. No one separates." Then, footsteps. Soft, slow, coming from behind them. Selker turned, his heart hammering. The emergency lights flickered once, just for a second. Enough to show them a glimpse. Daniel was standing right in front of them. No one had heard him move. No one had seen him approach. Yet there he was. Selker staggered back, raising his weapon. Daniel wasn't smiling anymore. His eyes, they weren't human. Dark, empty, staring straight into Selker's soul. The warship groaned. The metal around them creaked and twisted, as if something immense was pressing against the ship from the outside. Daniel's voice echoed, but his lips didn't move. "You shouldn't have taken me." Selker's breathing was ragged. He had faced enemies before, pirates, mercenaries, even other warlords. But this was something else entirely. "What are you?" Selker roared. Daniel blinked slowly. "You still don't understand, do you?" The lights flickered again. Selker felt it before he saw it. The air shifted, as if reality itself had tilted. His officers screamed. Selker turned just in time to see them lifted off the ground, their bodies twisting unnaturally as an invisible force pulled them into the air. Their limbs convulsed, their eyes rolling back. And then, they'd vanished. No sound, no struggle, just gone. Selkor was alone. The ship shuddered violently. The walls trembled. The emergency lights flickered wildly. Daniel stepped forward. Selkor aimed his weapon at the human's head. "Stay back." Daniel sighed. "You still think that will help you?" Selkor fired. The blast passed straight through Daniel, as if he wasn't even there. Selkor's mind snapped. That was impossible. He had seen Daniel in the interrogation room. He had restrained him, scanned him. He was real. But now, he wasn't. Daniel took another step. Selkor stumbled backward. I don't understand." Daniel's voice was calm, cold, final. "Then let me help you understand." The ship groaned one last time. Then, everything went black. Selkor awoke to silence. Cold, empty, a void. He opened his eyes, but there was nothing to see, just an endless blackness stretching in every direction. His breath came out in short, panicked bursts, but he couldn't even hear his own heartbeat. Where was he? The warship, his crew, the human, Daniel. Selkor's claws twitched as he tried to move. His body felt weightless, like he was floating in the void of space, but he knew he wasn't dead. At least, he didn't think so. A footstep. Selkor froze. Another footstep, then another. Slow, steady, coming toward him. Selkor tried to turn, but his body wouldn't respond. He was trapped. Then, a voice. "Do you understand now?" Selkor felt the words more than he heard them. They echoed inside his skull, filling every corner of his mind. A figure emerged from the blackness. Daniel. But this wasn't the frail old man he had captured. No. This Daniel stood tall, his presence looming over Selkor like a mountain. His face was calm, his eyes cold and ancient, far too ancient for a human. "You thought you were strong." Selkor's throat went dry. "You thought you could take what you wanted, that your warships made you powerful." Daniel took another step forward. The void trembled. "But you never asked the most important question." Selkor's mouth barely moved as he forced the words out. What? Question. Daniel tilted his head. "What happens when you take the wrong prisoner?" Selkor's mind reeled. He had fought against impossible odds before. He had crushed planets, burned fleets, enslaved entire civilizations. But now he was nothing. He had been reduced to prey. Daniel took another step. Selkor tried to move, tried to escape, but he couldn't. "You stole me from my world," Daniel said softly. His voice was almost gentle, but Selkor had never felt more terrified in his life. "Now, I will show you what that means." Selkor's vision cracked. Not his sight, his vision. The void split apart, shattering like glass, revealing a burning universe beyond. Stars collapsed. Planets crumbled. Massive warships, Sarkari warships, were being ripped apart by forces Selkor couldn't even comprehend. And in the middle of it all, Daniel stood, but not alone. 1,000 figures stood behind him. Some were human. Others were beyond anything Selkor had ever seen. Each one carried the same presence, the same unstoppable force. Selkor's breathing became erratic. Who were they? Daniel stepped even closer, and suddenly, Selkor was falling through time, through space, through something he could not define. Flashes of war, of devastation, of forces beyond anything the Sarkari Empire had ever imagined. Selkor finally understood. They had not captured an old man. They had awakened something far, far worse. And now, there was no escape. As the void swallowed him whole, Selkor let out a final, silent scream.